Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? If you had to design the perfect myth for a modern artist, the doomed genius, the bohemian outsider, the one who burns bright and dies young, you'd probably end up inventing Amedeo Modigliani. Born in Livorno in 1884, Modigliani arrived in Paris just as it was becoming the epicenter of the avant-garde. He moved through Montmartre and Montparnasse, part of that loose constellation of artists, poets, and opportunists who were busy reinventing what art could be. Picasso was there, Brancusi too, and Modigliani, well, Modigliani was there too, though not quite of it. He tried sculpture first, influenced by the so-called primitive art and by Constantine Brancusi, but ill health and poverty pushed him back to painting. And that's where he found the thing that we now instantly recognize. Those elongated faces, the swan-like necks, the almond eyes often left blank as if the sitter were both present and elsewhere at the same time. Modigliani found his signature style. He painted quickly, sold rarely, drank heavily, and lived by most accounts chaotically. There's a story, it's possibly apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat, that he would trade drawings for meals or drinks, only to see them later resold for far, far more. He died in 1920 at age just 35 from tubercular meningitis. The next day, his partner, Jean Hébuterne, pregnant with their second child, threw herself from a window. And that more or less sealed the legend. But here's the thing about legends. They tend to obscure as much as they reveal. And in Modigliani's case, they've also helped create one of the messiest, most contested markets in all of art. Because where you have high value, high demand, and a relatively small body of work, you get something else too. Endless disagreement. Which brings us to today's question. Is it a Modigliani? Because for decades, even the leading experts have not agreed. There isn't just one definitive catalogue raisonne. There are several, and they don't always line up. Paintings accepted by one authority are rejected by another. Careers and fortunes have turned on decisions like these. But something new just happened. Something that may shift the ground beneath all of this. In what appears to be a first in the art world, a painting authenticated with the aid of AI image analysis has been accepted into a Modigliani catalogue raisonne. The work, Young Woman in a Fur Collar, has been included in the new catalogue compiled by Mark Restellini. The AI analysis was carried out by Carina Popovici and her team at Art Recognition. And importantly, it wasn't done in isolation. It was structured across different, sometimes competing Modigliani catalogue raisonnes, and then came back positive across the board. Now, inclusion in a catalogue raisonne is about as close as the art world gets to a final word. It's scholarly recognition, it's market validation, and often it can mean a multi-million-dollar difference. The new catalogue includes 100 works that had been excluded from the previous definitive catalogue raisonne. That's potentially 100 new artworks, each of which could be worth millions. To unpack all of this, I'm joined by Carina Popovici, founder of Art Recognition, and by Georgina Adam, one of the most insightful observers of the art market, writing for the Financial Times and the Art newspaper. Georgina and Carina, thanks so much for speaking with me about a very exciting piece of breaking news, really, related to a brand new catalogue raisonne about Modigliani. But before we dig into that, Georgina, could you tell us about your work as an arts journalist so the listeners can get a better sense of your past and career?
Fine. Well, yes. Hello, and thank you so much for having me. Yes, I've been a journalist, an arts journalist for many decades now, starting in France, moving to England, spending 5 years in Japan as well, and all the time covering the arts and particularly the art market. That's my particular speciality. And I actually met the author of this catalogue raisonne many years ago when I was living in France. So it goes right back, and I'm really interested in this conversation that we're going to have today about this new catalogue raisonne. Shall I just say what a catalogue raisonne is?
That would be great. That was one of the questions that we shouldn't assume that listeners know exactly what we mean by that. So what is a catalogue raisonne and how are they usually put together?
So a catalogue raisonne is the definitive list of all the works of art. We're talking about art that have been produced by a painter or an artist. Sometimes they can take even decades to prepare. People work very, very hard and long on them in order to chase down every single work of art. It's easy, obviously, if the artist is alive, but it's much more difficult if the artist is dead, and particularly if he's been long dead. So they are very important because you go to the catalogue raisonne if you want to know if a work is genuine or not. And this is why they're so important.
So this one is distinctive from how many others have been made in that traditionally, at least the more recent ones are usually made by a team of art historians and often updated over the course of many editions, sometimes over many decades. This one is the work primarily of one art historian. What is distinctive about this one?
I think what's distinctive about this one is the fact that Modigliani himself died in poverty, as we know, and in chaos, quite frankly. And the result is that there was no inventory, there were no archives, there was nothing left. It's also, he has the unfavorable distinction of having probably 6 or 7 different catalogue raisonne who have been established over the years, some by people who, quite frankly, inserted fakes. Modigliani himself was almost immediately faked because he was reaching success just before his death, and his market took off very, very quickly. And he's quite easy to fake. They're obviously they're 20th century paintings. They've got this quite characteristic look, these sort of long swan necks, these sort of slightly blank eyes. And it's really has been a faker's paradise because there are no records, or there were no records. There was one catalogue, which was by somebody called Cerrone, which was considered to be the best catalogue. The other ones have been disregarded. But he didn't include everything. Particularly, he never included something he hadn't seen, and he'd never been to America. So he didn't include anything that was in America. Now, Restolini has added 100 to the number that Cerrone had put in his catalogue, which is a very large number.
It's a very large number indeed. And you might think that multiple catalogue raisonnes mean things are easier to keep track of, but in fact, it can be quite the opposite, particularly if they don't agree. So another episode, we talk about the famous Wacker Van Gogh case with rival catalogues raisonne that couldn't agree and led to a court case that had to call upon material forensic evidence because the experts were at loggerheads. Before we go on to talk about this catalog in particular and the work in question, Carina, I wanted to ask you, catalog raisonnes are very important for teaching an AI how to recognize an artist's oeuvre. So what does that process look like? And what's particularly tricky about Modigliani, especially when we have so many catalog raisonnes that don't always agree?
In this particular case, the biggest challenge was to decide what to train on in the first place, because as we were saying, there are different catalogs. And this is, a big problem because, as Georgina said before, for most of the artists, there is a kind of, universally accepted catalog that defines the body of work really. And that would be the foundation really for the AI training and then for the AI authenticity analysis. But as we are discussing for Modigliani, the situation is much more complex. So yes, there is the Cerrone catalog that has been used as the standard by the major auction houses, for example. But there are shortcomings to that, as Georgina has explained. So what we have done essentially, we have extended the search, so to speak. So being aware of the fact that this Cerrone might not be everything. And then there are the catalogues by Parisot, there is the catalog by Patani. So we have taken these three major catalogues. I mean, there are more, but we have, restricted to these three major catalogues that do not fully agree to one another. So it's really quite important to specify, because this does have an influence on the AI training, because, some of the works, they are excluded, some are disputed, etc. So essentially, I mean, the basis for the AI training in this case, it hasn't been a clear reference point, but we really had to start with several conflicting scholarly positions. And that is a problem from a methodological point of view, obviously. So essentially what we did very plainly, we have trained actually four. So we have trained separate AI models, like on each of these catalogs. We have also created a fourth model, in fact, that was based only on the works that all of the three catalogs agree on. So that was really the kind of the common ground that we have used, just to be certain.
Okay, so if we are looking at multiple catalog raisonnés as the means of teaching the AI, what I'm interested in asking next, and maybe Georgina, you can weigh in on this, when you get a new catalog raisonné and it appears on your desk and you have a chance to flip through it, with all of your experience as someone with a deep knowledge of the art trade and having handled many catalog raisonnés over your career, what do you look for? And what might be a sign that something requires further investigation? Are there any sort of potential red flag in an entry about a work that would make you think, I should look into this more closely?
Well, I think that what is interesting in this particular case is the works that have been demoted, the ones that are no longer there. While I was preparing this, I actually spoke to one other person who's been working on Modigliani, and he said that when he is approached with a work that he doesn't think is genuine, he doesn't include it at all. He doesn't reject it. And you know why? Because he's frightened of lawsuits. Modigliani has become so expensive that if somebody thinks they have a Modigliani, they certainly do not want to hear that their work is not going to be included. And they might even go to court. This has had a really chilling effect on scholarship, unfortunately.
So, Georgina, what do you think that it would happen to paintings that were sold as authentic Modiglianis beforehand? So, like based on the Cerrone catalog, for example, that are no longer included in the Stellini catalog. What would be the status of those paintings?
I think it's going to be a disaster for the owners, because they thought they had a painting that was worth sometimes an enormous amount of money. And are they going to go to court? Are they going to contest? I mean, there is apparently, according to Restellini, there are 15. 2, I believe he couldn't find where they were. They might have been destroyed, so he didn't include them. 2 from the Cerrone catalogue. But the other 13, from the point of view of the market value, it's a disaster, because this was something that was accepted and no longer is accepted. And one shudders to think if somebody's bought it for an enormous amount of money, thinking they had a genuine Modigliani on their hands, and now they don't. On the other hand, of course, it had to be said that those whose works were sort of in limbo because they were not in Cerrone and now have been authenticated by Restellini, that's very good news, because all of a sudden they've certainly gained a lot of value.
So essentially, the hypothesis is right now that this new Restellini catalog will become the new standard.
But that is the question that we're all asking ourselves. Will it become? I mean, for a start, the scholars have got to look at it. They've got to go work by work to see the methodology. I mean, I think Restellini has worked extremely long and extremely hard on this. So one absolutely can't put into any sort of doubt his hard work on this. But we shall have to see, because ultimately the market will decide.
Be curious to know, for the works that were newly added, around 100 works that were not in the previous catalog.
Yes.
That's such a large number. I'm wondering what we make of that. What was your initial reaction? Or do most of them come from America and that's why they weren't in the previous catalog?
I don't think most of them come from America. And I think it is worrying. However, we do know that Modigliani, particularly towards the end of his life, he was very chaotic. He lived a very chaotic life. He was an alcoholic. He was taking drugs. He also was very sick because he had tuberculosis. And he apparently, according to the biography that was just looking back through, which I'd already read by Meryl Secrest, he would hand out drawings, he would hand out paintings, when he was out drinking with some friends. So I think it is conceivable that there are many out there. 100 is a very high number. And I think that time will only tell whether those 100 are accepted ultimately by the auction houses, because they are the ultimate arbiters. If they refuse to take something for sale, that's not a good thing.
What I'd like to add to this, if I may, that we haven't yet tested this new, around 100 paintings. So, once we've done that, once we've run the AI analysis on them, I think I will be in a better position to, to have an opinion. But I mean, I fully agree with you. I think that in a way, like a catalog is almost like a snapshot, right? Like it reflects, the scholarly position based on the information that's available at a certain point in time. And yes, I mean, as you are saying, in a case like Modigliani, like, a new catalog where so much new information went in, it really can reshape the market and become perhaps the new standard if the big auction houses perhaps start accepting it.
Carina, I have a question for you. How confident are you? Because we know that there is one picture, don't we, that is in both Restolini and that was also authenticated by yourselves. I know that Restolini, who I think everyone would say he's not always easy to deal with, I think he's not necessarily convinced. What is your response to that?
Yeah. The first thing I would say, I guess, is that, I'm fully aware that this hesitation, let's call it, around AI might actually come from misunderstandings, about how the method actually works. I'm saying this because, it's AI is a highly technical method, obviously, and has entered a field that has traditionally been shaped by scholarship, art historical scholarship. So I think, to some extent, some friction is really quite unavoidable. But, people are sometimes asking questions such as, can an AI model train from book scans, or can it learn from 5 images, or can it say anything without looking at the underdrawing? So all of these questions, they are fair questions, they should be asked, but I think they also show that there might still be some confusion, about how the method actually works. Our technology is published, is peer reviewed, but those articles are quite inaccessible, I think, to art historians because they are extremely technical. Of course, the answers to those questions is, AI doesn't learn from 5 images. It doesn't learn from scans from books. And there is a lot of work going into building, curating, as we say, the training data sets. So to answer all your questions, I think what I would say to Mr. Restolini is that I would really welcome the chance to just sit down together, like go through the methodology, answer all his questions, make sure the process is properly understood. Of course, it is very important to stress the point that AI is not meant to be a replacement for his own judgment. Of course not, but it's just like another method that can add some meaningful evidence in those cases.
I've always said that when you authenticate a work of art, there are sort of 3 things that you should be looking at. You should be looking at the provenance, you should be looking at the forensics, eventually, i.e. analysis of the pigments and the support and so on. And then there's connoisseurship. So what you're saying is that you're adding a 4th.
Yes, we had the human connoisseurship that started in the 17th century, I think. And then, the technical art history has been enriched with the forensics. And then, of course, there is the provenance that is kind of like the second method. And AI to me is like a natural evolution. There is like a new tool, a new method that has appeared and that can be useful alongside all the others. So I think this is really the way to understand it.
So it's not a stool with 3 legs, it's now a stool with 4 legs.
I like that you mentioned that, Georgina, because I've been trying to figure out which analogy to use, whether it's legs, a chair, a stool, or pillars. And I was leaning towards pillars. But one of the things that's also important to keep in mind is that with all new technological advances, there has been an initial hesitation on the part of people who are already entrenched within a field of study in art history or elsewhere. And just as, when the cleaned Sistine Chapel ceiling was revealed, people were up in arms because it no longer looked like they expected to, but in fact, it looked like it had originally been meant to. So I think it's natural to have this sort of reaction, and then this will fade with time. The other thing that's interesting to me is that because the AI is trained on catalogue raisonne, in many ways it builds off of the other three legs or pillars.
Sure.
The catalogue raisonne should have as much provenance as we know about the works in question. It should have been put together by one or more top experts, and it should have information about material forensic testing when available on the works in question. So the fourth pillar is really built upon the first three. One of my questions for you is, so is a catalogue raisonne more reliable seeming if it has multiple authors, or if it's an older one that's been updated by new scholars, or if it's a monograph, or rather written by a single author? Does one of them give you more confidence, or does the single author potentially have this sort of trap of the possibility of hypothesis bias?
And I think in this particular case, the more the better. I think it also takes away some of the pressure, because I don't think it's quite right, that there is so much power and implicitly so much pressure, that's concentrated on a single individual sometimes. So I think it's really quite healthy to spread that a bit.
Yes, so can I just butt in and say it does rather depend on the artist, though, doesn't it? Because perhaps with a major artist, obviously there's a number of people who've studied the work, but with the less well-known artist, you may really only have one person who really knows that work. So it's not because they decide, that they decide that they're setting up as the gatekeeper. It's just that there aren't that many people with expertise.
So I actually have one more question, maybe for Georgina, before we go to the reveal, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Georgina, I'm curious, over the course of your career, have you come across a successful lawsuit where someone got bothered by the fact that their work was not included in a new catalog and successfully sued the publisher or the author of the catalog? Or is this all someone's opinion, however informed, therefore there's no satisfaction in bringing a lawsuit?
I think if you go back in time, and funnily enough, I think that Modigliani himself, there was a case when a judge in France said that something that had been rejected by Restolini himself should be in the catalogue. However, it has to be said that if you put into a catalogue that it has been imposed upon the author of the catalogue by a law court, and court appointed experts are not always the best people because they've got to deal with a broad range of art. So, yes, there have been cases. It doesn't necessarily, from the point of view of the monetary value or even the reception of the work, it doesn't really improve the chances of that work of art if it's court ordered.
Okay, that's a very good answer. So before we reveal the results of the test, what can you tell us about the picture in question?
The novelty of this picture before anything, is that it's really, as far as I'm aware of, is the first instance when an expert and the AI have analyzed or verified the authenticity of a painting independently of each other, and they have reached the same conclusion in a quite spectacular way. And so the painting is called Young Woman with a Fur Collar, and it has now the catalogue raisonne number 272. It is a quite typical woman portrait, I'd say, for Modigliani, with the blank eyes and the swan collar. So really, the style is very recognizable. And we have worked very extensively on this painting, actually, because of the issue that we have been discussing at first, the fact that we had multiple training data sets. And it was really a relief, to look at the probabilities, and they are a bit different. And I will explain shortly how are they different, but they all point at a strongly positive result. So on the smallest data set, which is the common, so the images that are being accepted in all of the three catalogues, so the authenticity probability was around 66%, I think. And on the data sets, on the catalog with the highest number of images was around 80%. So the probability score varied within the 66 to 80% range. So technically, it really makes sense because this is something that we've seen also in other tests, like for bigger data sets, usually the probabilities, they are a bit higher. So that's the result that we've got on this painting. But I mean, what's really important, like I said, is the fact that it came out consistently positive. I'd like to make a comment on this and perhaps also address one last question from my side to Georgina, because we seem to have right now a situation where, I mean, like I said, where AI and Mark Cristallini, they have independently reached the same conclusion. On the other hand, this expert might not necessarily be fond of AI. And so I'd like to ask you, Georgina, how would you comment on this? Like keeping in mind the fact that, both the AI and the expert, they may have reviewed many, many different paintings that they have been submitted to as Modigliani's. I mean, we've got loads of them ourselves. So do you think that is just a coincidence, really, the fact that we have arrived at the same conclusion?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. But I think, in a sense, having spent possibly 30 years working on Modigliani, I think that it perhaps is a little bit difficult for an expert to accept that there could be another way of working that produces the same results. And so I think it's inevitable. It's to an extent a challenge to his methods, isn't it? It shouldn't be. It should be something that backs up his methods. But I think human nature is that, having spent so much time working on something, perhaps you feel, well, is all of that work that I did for nothing?
We're seeing something similar to this with AI debates in the news about AI's ability to write texts that are really quite good, but we don't like the idea of that because we writers want to be the ones to write our own text. And then readers don't like the idea that they're sort of being fooled. They want to know if the text was produced by a human or not.
Yes.
But in fact, AI can be a very useful tool that can augment a researcher or a writer's work without taking it over. And I think that's a similar conclusion that will eventually be reached. But it may be another decade before people come around to seeing AI as ideally another tool in the arsenal that the expert can draw on, that's not going to replace them, but be something that they would look to, the way that you can look to multispectral imaging as another tool that can inform their decisions.
If I may add something here, because this might be interesting perhaps for our listeners. We start encountering the situation where art owners, before coming to us, they ask ChatGPT. They put the image of their painting into ChatGPT, and you can imagine what comes back. The difference, or one of the things that I've stressed many times, and I will continue to do so, I think, for a while, is how important it is, this process that we call curating the training data set. Like if you just scrap the internet and you try not, you're not going to get anywhere. So this is really paramount. It might sound like a small thing, but this is what differentiates us, a mosquito, from ChatGPT that trains on everything. But, sometimes like less is really more. And in this case, it absolutely makes a difference. The quality of the training data set is really everything.
So, Georgina, maybe a final question for you. When you are looking for a story that you think you'd like to write on, what are the attributes that you see that make you think, yes, this is going to be something that's going to hold my focus and it's going to be of general interest? And is there one of those stories related to the Modigliani catalog? Because I believe that you're planning to write on it.
Yes. So I think, from the point of view of a journalist, topicality is the first thing. There's got to be a reason why somebody's reading that now. Okay. Now, obviously, a newspaper, a magazine are two different things. And in a magazine, you might want to analyze a situation and produce something that's not that topical. But certainly for a newspaper, for news, it's got to be topical. It's got to interest the public. I think people are always curious about learning, looking behind the veil, in a sense. They're always the inside story. That's what they want. They want somebody to get to tell them something that they wouldn't have known otherwise, to explain to them. So I think that is another aspect. And I think that this Modigliani is actually a really good story. because it's, first of all, there's a lot of money and people are fascinated by money. There's no doubt about it. Somebody who spent $170 million on a work of art, they are curious about that. There is in the art world, unfortunately, there's slightly this schadenfreude going on, is that, that person, he was fooled because he spent all of that money and he got a fake. So I think that is always an aspect as well that makes a story makes a good story. But I think also all the details, and I think it is to an extent up to the journalists themselves to make a story interesting or not interesting, quite frankly, the way it's written, going deep into a subject. And that's important as well. But I would say the most important thing is the topicality. And we have a great topical hook here because we have this incredible new catalogue raisonne coming out of an artist who we know lived a chaotic life. And on top of that, he's promoted another 100 works out of an oeuvre that was there were about 300 or 400 accepted, and now we're almost up to 500. Could make a big difference to the market.
It certainly could. And it's also, each one is its own story. I particularly like books that are effectively the biography of a single object.
That's
and
wonderful.
There's 100 new ones to write about, plus I guess 15 that with less happy owners that also have interesting biographies.
Yes, absolutely.
But thanks so much to both of you for taking the time to appear on the show. Georgina, I look forward to anything you write on any topic, but about this one in particular. And we can conclude that Young Woman with a Fur Collar is indeed by Modigliani, according to Art Recognition's AI analysis and according to the expert. And it's always a happy ending when the experts and the scientific investigation agree. Everybody's happy with that. So I'm delighted to have that be our conclusion for this evening. And thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Noah. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Is It? The podcast. This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork. Backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration, Art Recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.